So I want to talk a little bit about who Roger is and why I wanted to invite him here, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So professionally, Roger has an amazing story. He has been a professional cyclist. He's been an executive in the corporate world. He has started several different businesses and several different nonprofits. And it's just all around a really incredible human. On a more personal level, Roger is someone who just lives with a lot of integrity and really models his values and his priorities through his actions. And I think about Roger as one of those people who, if you were, stranded by the side of the road and your car broke down, where a lot of people might say, hey, let me know if you need anything. Let me know if you need help. Roger would drive his car over and he would show up and he would have his toolbox and he'd be ready to help. That's just the kind of person who Roger is. So that's just a little bit about him as a person and a professional. And in the context of today, as I've gotten to know Roger over the last couple of years, two things have emerged. As we started talking and getting to know each other more, the first thing that I noticed about Roger is I said, Roger, you have a really incredible story. There's a lot here. And then the second thing I noticed is, Roger, you have this amazing toolkit that you just use as part of your life. And this is not something that everybody does. This is kind of unique to have this robust toolkit like you have. And as you saw in the meeting invite, we have named this toolkit the Cool Shit Toolkit, which we will talk a little bit more about today. So that's just a little bit of grounding in why we're here, who Roger is, and why I was excited to talk with him today. And we're going to talk about the Cool Shit Toolkit, and we'll talk about Roger. So to start us off, Roger, you have all these tools, you have all these things that you do as part of your daily and weekly flow. And like we've talked about, these are not things that most people do every day, all day, throughout their week. And what I think is cool about your set of tools is you didn't just pull these out of thin air one day and say, hey, I think this is a good idea, I want to start using these. You really came to these tools to help you thrive and help you live in some fairly challenging times. So could you talk a little bit about where you were and how you arrived at these tools in the first place?
Well, high level, you're right. They came out of necessity. I found myself backed into a corner. I found myself totally out of control emotionally, and I didn't know which way was up. And I had to do something. And this is what the result is, the collection of tools that you started with. Cool shit, boy, that's some cool shit. And we kind of named it from there. But where it came from was just a long list of lows in my life. We all have highs, we all have lows. I've had some amazing highs. I've traveled all over the world. I have two amazing kids. Like you said, I've had an athletic career and started a couple nonprofits for children at risk. And at the same time, for as many highs as I had just as many lows. And actually on my list, there's more lows than highs. But I figured out that I needed to try to dwell in the highs, dwell in the sunshine. And, I like to say that we have seasons in our life. We have dark seasons and bright seasons and warm seasons and cold seasons. And I figured out that I had to do whatever I had to do to make it work. And I just want to say one thing, that I didn't get here by myself. I worked really hard to stay alive and to do something. And just as much as I worked hard, there were 10 people, I could rattle their names right now, that saved my life. They stepped forward and saved my life. 5 of them, if they wouldn't have done it, my kids would have never been born. And the other 5, I wouldn't be here today. So I just want to be clear that this talk is not about me. It's about us. There's a community of people that step up. But so a lot of trauma, if you want to call it that, but I call it living. At 5 years old, my mother became mentally ill, and a little bit of back and forth, and she got locked up in a state mental institution and never got well, never came back to the house, never came back into our family. And my dad, who was working full time and going to school to try to get his second master's degree, he did everything he could. And we just lived, you know. He wasn't home a lot, so we're running around and just enjoying ourselves and learning and growing. And even though all that, you know, you say, Roger, you have an amazing story. Well, you and I argued about that for months.
I recall.
So you said, oh, you have an amazing story. I'm like, my story ain't shit. And so we're not here because of the story. We're here because of the tools, but the story frames it and puts it into context. So my mother went away. My dad did his best. And how I frame it is that my life isn't a story, is I had a great job. You know, I have all these things and I have a retirement account. And my dad was there and he took care of us to the best of his ability. And then I think the third qualifier for my story being special is my dad never told me I was stupid. You know, he never told me I was worthless. He didn't squash my dreams. He, despite all of the challenges that we put him through, he told us all the time, I love you no matter what. And so, do inventory of all that. I don't have a story, but there were some experiences. So mom's locked up, dad's doing his best, off we go, having a glorious time. And I, you know, that period of my life was like the golden ticket. I mean, we were having a blast. We could afford to go out for milkshakes a couple times a month. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had enough. And there we were. So my dad, who was working towards his second master's, got it when I was 12. And by that time, mom had gotten out. She was locked up for years and she got out. And we'd be playing outside during the week and she'd just show up. And she didn't have a car. She was walking and she would just show up. And it was horrible and it was scary. And she kind of came at us and I need money and your dad is this and that. And we'd run inside and lock the door and call my dad. And he would call the police and we'd watch from the second story window as the cops showed up and she'd argue with them and off she went in the police car. So that was fun. And then 13 years old, I started doing drugs and it hooked me and I was an addict right away. And by the time I got to high school, drugs had escalated. I'd gone up the food chain and I got to high school. I was going to a high-end college prep engineering placement public school, Baltimore City Public School. I lived in Baltimore, me and my three sisters and my dad. And I made it through 10th grade and I dropped out because there was no room in my life for drugs and school. So I did that. And on my 17th birthday, I got a job at a bicycle store and that turned into a 40-year career in the bike business that I'm still in part-time. But the drugs kept going. And by the time I was 18 or so, I became a junkie, if you know what that is. So the needle ruled my life, and it just kept going, everything under the sun. So sorry, I'll try to speed it up. I overdosed twice in 2 months, and I knew I had to stop because I was going to be dead by the time I was 21. I knew it. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. And actually, I had a nightmare for, I don't know, 6 months, maybe a year, the same exact nightmare that I knew I was going to die. So I decided that I would quit everything. And I was already, I don't know, 7 or 8 years in, 9 years in. But I didn't do it for me. I saw the faces of my dad and my sisters and my friends at my funeral. And I could envision that and see the pain in their face. And I couldn't do that to them, because if they did that to me, I'd be pissed. So I decided to stop doing drugs. Well, that's the easy part. The hard part is actually doing it. So once I made a firm commitment to stop, 4 friends stepped forward and got me off the needle. And it took a while, and it was hard. And so I got off the needle, and I knew that I had to reinvent myself. I needed to do something. So I moved to Vail, Colorado. I was a ski bum for 2 years. I started racing my mountain bike a little bit, but I was still using all the drugs. I just wasn't putting them in a needle. And I came back from Vail after 2 years, and I was motivated. I was still using drugs, but I was motivated. I'd done some racing in Colorado, and I'd beaten some pro racers, and I'd walk up for my prize and I'd win an inner tube. And they came up behind me. I beat them. They'd win money. They'd have an envelope of money. I was like, okay, wow, okay. So by the time I got home from Vail back to Baltimore, I got a little more serious about racing, and I really got serious about getting clean. So most of the really, really bad stuff was gone. The cocaine was gone, the heroin was gone, the meth was gone, all the barbiturate drugs, which are kind of like opioids these days. The LSD was gone for the most part. And on April 4th, 1989, I got clean. That was the last time I used drugs 31 years ago. And I started racing, and I decided, again, kind of reinvent myself. Now, what do I do with all this time? So I got my pro racing license later that year in 1989. In 1990, I started racing pro. And I had sponsors, and I made money, and I felt an incredible responsibility to the people supporting me. So I took it very seriously, and I worked very, very, very hard while trying to balance a full-time work career at the bicycle stores. And by pushing hard and trying hard, I got hurt every once in a while. And part of the way through my racing career, I met a woman. We got married, had a kid, bought a house, had a kid. I got a big boy job, the big boy job. We were okay living in Baltimore. I got a promotion. We moved to Wisconsin, where I am now. Had a second kid. And it was too much. I just achieved way more than I could have ever imagined in my life, considering where I came from. We were almost foster kids. That's a long story, but it was, that close. So we'd moved to Wisconsin, and I was out of control emotionally, and the work was a lot. Things at home were bad, which set me off. And I tried to fix it, and I couldn't. And just about every item in my life was causing me pain. But I went to work every day and I came home every night at 5 o'clock. And I played with my kids every second I got. And so I got stuck and I did a lot of different things and I couldn't fix it. I was stuck, dead in the water. So I did the only thing that I could possibly do. I opened an Excel spreadsheet and I figured it out. And in the first column A, it said, why or how am I unhappy? What am I unhappy about? And the second column said, what's the solution? And the third column said, what's the barrier to that solution? Why wouldn't that work? And the fourth column said, well, if that wouldn't work, what's the new solution? And then the other column said, well, what's the barrier to that? And maybe I went a couple more times, but eventually I came up with an outcome. There it is, unhappiness.xls. Now it's .xlsx. But I figured it out. And most everything on that list, I think there were maybe 20 items on my list from 2003. Almost everything on the list I could do something about. There was a small little something that I could do to fix it. And so I started there. And there were a couple things on the list that I couldn't fix. Excuse me. And the things on the list that I couldn't fix, well, that was refreshing because I'd explored all the options. I did the math. And I got to the point where, the things I couldn't fix were inconsequential. I hated my car. Well, we didn't have money to buy a new car. I couldn't do anything about that. I just had to wait. And so I spell that on the list. But the solution was maybe I clean my car once a week. And maybe I buy a new stereo for $150 and put it in the shitty little car. And that started me off. I'd use measurements and metrics and all kinds of other stuff through my racing. I track my heart rate, my nutrition, and my calories and my recovery zones. And I write stuff down because when things swirl around in my head, I can't make total sense of them. But if I can speak them, if I can talk to someone, or if I can write them down, even better yet, because I'm talking to myself, then I challenge myself, is it true? By the time it comes off my little fingers on the keyboard or off my pen on paper. Mm-hmm. But that's how I started.
And how did that come to you? So, I love that story and that framework. What I observe is that for most of us, if we're spinning in a sea of anxiety or uncertainty or worry, the first thing that comes to mind is not necessarily to, make an Excel spreadsheet and make a really organized list of all of the different dimensions of our unhappiness or anxiety, and then write them down with possible solutions and possible barriers. How did that come to you? And for others who might be navigating some really hard stuff, what could be the first step that one might take toward doing something like that?
I think it came to me because I couldn't clear my head. There was too much going on. We had 2 small children. My wife was unhappy. I wasn't exercising, which makes me grumpy. I was traveling all over the world all the time. I think I was platinum with Delta at that point, 100,000 miles. There were too many things going on. And I felt like I just couldn't stop any of it long enough to really look at it. And it was too unclear. And I just forced myself to take some time one night. I'm sure it was after midnight because I'd work all night many times, got a bad reputation for that. 3 a.m. emails to my team. but it's the only thing I knew how to do. You know, I was barely talking to my father. Him and I stopped talking to him when I was 13, and we really didn't fire that up again until I was in my 30s with consistency. So it was the only thing I had to do that could clear my head. And I get it, right? I don't drink. I gave it up 9 years ago. Me and my second wife stopped at the same time. You know, we're stressed out. We grab a bottle of wine or a beer or a doobie, and we turn on Lifetime, or we reach for Ben and Jerry's. I don't do those things because they don't help me. I came too far. You know, there's too much downtime, too many missed opportunities. And I wasn't going to rest in mediocrity. After I got clean from drugs, I didn't ever want to look back. And so I think for people to try to answer your question, I'm sorry, to try to answer your question is you got to show up for your own life and figure out what works with you. A spreadsheet might not work. Meditation might work, long walks, talk with your sister, talk with your mom. Don't talk to your kids about that. But it's avoiding avoidance. You know, Ben and Jerry's is an avoidance. Lifetime's an avoidance. You know, Hess Winery is an avoidance. However it works for you, everybody's different. You know, I have so much stuff. People are going to think I'm bananas, but it works for me. It works really well for me. And it's a lot of what kept me alive. So I think clear your head. How do you do that? How do you make sense of the thoughts? How do you organize reality? Because I think that's what we're stuck in. You know, we have an emotional reality and we have a technical reality, and emotion wins. And we're upset and everything's a disaster and it's the biggest, hardest thing ever. Well, no, it's not all the time. I had to pull this on my kids, like both of them independently 4 months ago before the virus. They were both losing their mind over something. And I said, they were still crying and carrying on. And I said to each one of them, I said, what's the worst thing in your life that's ever going to happen? And they both stopped crying immediately. And they both said the same thing. Either you or mom dies. I said, okay, well, that's going to happen. Bet on it. 99% chance we die before you, I hope. And so how are you going to handle that? And what's the benchmark for pain? And what's the benchmark for the worst thing ever, right? You're upset. You have an exam tomorrow. You're upset. You know, you're fighting with your girlfriend. But is it really the worst thing ever? So how you clear your head and how you put things in perspective, and how do you look at reality and control your controllables? You know, I couldn't control if we got a new car or not, but I could control if it's clean. I could control if I showed up for work in the best state that I could, or the relationship, or we set up date nights or whatever. So I think that's my answer. If I covered all that ground, did I cover it?
No, that's great, and I love what you're saying, and I hear a couple of things underneath what you're saying. The first thing I hear is to actually be willing to look at the thing in front of us rather than avoiding it. So, you know, you mentioned these different kinds of addiction, and I think that's completely true. Like, you know, it's said that we all have our own addictions, you know, whether that's drugs or alcohol or something more societally acceptable like work or exercise or whatever that might be. So rather than, when those hard feelings come up, rather than sort of stuffing them down and distracting ourselves or channeling our energy into Netflix, the first thing that I hear you saying is to be willing to look at them, which is often really hard. Look at them and face them and put them on paper and write them down and look them in the eye on the spreadsheet. And sometimes there's some ugly stuff on the spreadsheet. And then the second, or the paper or the list or whatever, the second thing I hear you saying is, once we face them and are willing to look at them, to really get to get clear with ourselves and have a bit of a heart to heart to look at, of this big list and all of these things, what are the things that I can do? What are the things that I can control? You know, we talked in the last couple of sessions about the idea of the circle of concern and the circle of influence. So what are those things in the circle of influence that I can do something about? And what choices can I make in order to create some kind of positive change?
Exactly. I would add to that, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I finished the 10th grade. That was the end of my academic career. In my experience, trauma doesn't go away. You got to face it. More than face it, you got to stare it down. More than stare it down, you got to be bigger than it. Now, you can't all the time. There's pain, the worst pain ever. I've never experienced that one. You know, I've experienced number two. Number one has brushed me. But you put it in perspective. I have two lists. I could flash them right here out of my silly little green book. One of them is the hits that I've experienced in my life. I have 20 different things that took my breath away and crippled me. And I couldn't move, sometimes for years. Because I didn't
Talk
see it
about that?
or I was, what's that?
Can we talk about that? Because I think that's a really good point, right? So you said something to me recently when we were talking about this, which is that you have to be tougher. You have to be tougher than the toughest circumstances. And I think overall you're a person who has a lot of grit and you're really tough, and you're welcome. And what do you think about those situations when we just simply don't feel tougher than the tough circumstances? You know, it's like we simply don't have the energy, or it doesn't feel like we have the capacity to go head to head with those tough circumstances, or the number two hardest thing.
You know, you said it's grit. It is grit. And so I call it out. I write it down. I name it. I name it. When I'm judging people, I say, oh, I'm judging, sorry, or I'm assuming. But the reality is, hey, Margie, can you mute your microphone lower left?
I muted it. It's all good.
Okay, thanks. The hits that I've taken in my life, I look at them and I stare them down. And I was afraid for a long time before my mom died that I was going to have a very, very, very hard time dealing with that. And I didn't, thank goodness, but I had to stare it down. And the other thing that I do is I put together a list of, I call them time bombs, things that could go horribly, horribly wrong. And I have 11 things on my list that they would cripple me. They would take my breath away. So I think, you know, if I get back to your question, that I don't want to ignore it. I can't ignore it. And I have to face it. And for people facing really, really, really tough stuff, we all have our worst thing ever. You know, if you have kids, the worst thing that could ever happen to you is your child passes away or disappears. There's nothing worse than that. And we all carry our pain differently. We all carry our pain, and it's relative. You know, if we don't have kids and we don't have a dog and our parents are gone and whatever, the worst thing that could ever happen to us is our best friend gets sick. So it's relative, but I think you have to be able to put it in perspective. And so I try to put it in perspective, and I try to be extremely honest with myself, and I map it out. And sometimes I write down what I'm thankful for, and sometimes I look at my personal values list or my big list of 61 items that kind of define me, my opus. It's all different. I think I lost track of your question, but I'll stop so I don't ramble.
That's great. And a question that comes up for me as we're talking, and we've talked about this a little bit recently. You know, you mentioned that you have this list of 11 time bombs, which are really awful, horrible things that could happen. And so there's like this acceptance or acknowledgement of a very, very worst case reality. And I suspect that to a lot of people, that might seem really
Morbid.
morbid, yes, negative. And you know, you and I have talked about this balance of how do you hold the duality of being positive and optimistic and focusing on what you can control. And you know, I talk about it as creating from whatever's happening in front of you, and honoring, you know, these possibilities or realities, or this thing that we called a very morbid list of time bombs. What do you think about that, and how do we stay positive and optimistic while also honoring and acknowledging the reality that's before us, or like you've talked about, this potential reality of these time bombs?
I've given a lot of thought to that question. And I look at it like this, that through these peaks and valleys in my life, and I'd rather stand in the sunshine than stand in the dark. And the problem is, when I had these 20 hits, I couldn't move. And I was in the dark. And by identifying them, by naming them, by looking at them, by staring them down, by trying to be bigger than them, by trying to be crafty and work in a direction that's either going to help you or at least not screw you up anymore. I want to get back to the sunshine. Mm-hmm. And I'd rather stand in the sun, but make no bones about it. I got more hits coming. Mm-hmm. I got 20. I'll have at least 30 by the time I die. I know it. People I care for deeply are going to pass away before me. My number 3 on my list, she's 90. So, you know, I talk about that really hard stuff takes your breath away. Well, I have a list of 20 things that took my breath away. And my dad, who I love dearly, was not on that list. We saw that one coming. I talked to him on the phone the night before I screwed up and got the wrong plane ticket and I wasn't there. And I called him from the parking lot of Madison Airport and I knew it. And he said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, before he went in for his like 17th heart surgery or something. He's not even on my list. He didn't take my breath away. I cried my eyes out for a few days, but then I got up and carry on, right? So the thing is, when you can identify the toughest stuff ever, if one of my child dies, here's the top 3 things I would do. What's next on the list if both of them die at the same time? I had a hard time thinking it, more or less writing it, but it's written down. What are the top 3 things I would do if both kids died at the same time? You know, what are the top 3 things I would do if my second wife, ex-wife, passed away? So you keep going, and you know what it does by doing that, it lets you catch your breath faster. You're not laying in bed for 2 months drinking tequila. You're very, very heartbroken for a long time, but you're on your feet in a week or 2 and you kind of deal with it. We had a tragedy in our family, and you just can't swallow it. And it took a while for us to even face it and deal with it and get together about it. But then you start healing. And, through a lot of stuff I've been through, 2 divorces and all of it, a lot of it's time, but you just don't wait. You can wait, but if you lost somebody, I think they'd want you to live. I think they'd want you to get up. And so by facing it and naming it and staring it down and trying to be at least as big as the problem you have and maybe a teeny bit bigger, then you have a little bit of power and you get back on your feet quicker. And you can recover quicker. Does that make sense?
It does. And do you think that the fact that you think about those worst case scenarios has allowed you to maintain your sobriety? Because I think, a lot of people would have relapsed, going through some of the really immensely difficult things that you went through. And what is, incredible about your story is, as of April 4th, that day, you moved forward and you did not look back. And that is not an easy thing to do. And I'm curious, in those really hard moments when, shit hit the fan and the thing on your list happened, what did you turn to in those moments? And the fact that you had that list written down of, this is what I would do if this happened, do you feel that that is something that helped you to move forward from those really, really hard and tragic things?
Careful what you wish for. So I did my little list in 03 when everything was out of sorts. And in 05, the most horrible thing in my life happened. And that is our marriage broke up. And my kids were now going to live in a split family home, which was my biggest fear in the world. And getting together with my first wife, she knew it. I told her, if this is even a possibility, I'm not doing it. And so that happened. And I had already been clean from drugs for 15 years. And a fair amount of people were convinced that I'm a goner because I'm going to go buy some drugs. And I never even thought about it, because I knew that even if I did the weakest, smallest drug, it would immediately lead me all the way down the road, and I'm done. Like, I'm 0 to 100 on that stuff. And so I knew it. So I never was tempted to use drugs when my marriage fell apart and we split up and the kids were 3 and 5. And it's the biggest heartbreak of my life ever. Unless one of them passes away before me. So I didn't do drugs, but I hated the taste of alcohol. I never drank. I never saw my dad drink ever. There was never alcohol in the house, ever. I didn't like the smell. I didn't like the taste. But right before my marriage fell apart, ironically, I kind of got pushed into a situation at work where I found a taste for tequila. And so when my marriage fell apart, I started drinking, and I was an alcoholic for 5 years. I couldn't cope. But there's no way. I didn't think alcohol was going to kill me, but I was naive. It didn't, obviously, but it does. We all know that, duh. But I wasn't tough that day because I didn't have my time bombs list then. That happened more recently. I've been sober for 9 years now, and I'll never drink alcohol again. I don't need it. I'm tougher. I'm bigger. I'm bigger than alcohol, and I'm bigger than any problem that comes my way. Take your best shot. Not everybody has found that yet. And I acknowledge that. And it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard. But I think what you have to do to answer your question, you have to do inventory of what you're capable of, what your weaknesses are, what your strengths are, what your reality is, what options you have. And when push come to shove, when the worst of you comes out, what does that look like? That's scary, right? But again, it's truth.
Mm-hmm.
If you got to go all the way. And this is a really hard time right now. A friend of mine wants me to call him right now because he's like, I've never been more out of control. And I want to call him, but it's okay. But we have to know our own truth. And that was probably the biggest game changer for me. Unhappiness.xls helped, right? My daily to-do list helped. But the one thing that grounded me more than anything I've done, and I have, Cool Shit ToolKit is 30 plus. It was values. What do I stand for? What do I do? How do I act? When I'm backed into a corner, what decision do I make based on those 8 personal values that I have documented? And I can pretty much rattle them off.
So can we talk a little bit about that? And before we do, I just want to underline something you said, because I think it's really brilliant, which is that part of our work is facing and acknowledging the darkest part of ourselves. So when we're at our worst, who are we and what does that look like? What is that person tempted to do? What habits does he or she have? What coping mechanisms might come out that aren't necessarily healthy? And, to go back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, I think sometimes in our current culture, especially online where everything's shiny and tidy and pretty, that can be a really scary thing to do, to face that and look at that and be willing to do that inner work. So I just want to underline that, because I think that was a really brilliant point, that part of our ability to cope and have resilience and have grit and move forward is not only looking at the positive, but looking at the dark. And like you said, looking at that truth.
Absolutely. If you say dark and truth, I don't know if I'd name it dark. That's okay. I mean, it is, right? The worst possible thing that could ever happen to you in your life that cripples you. That's dark, but it's truth. Number 1 on my list is my kids pass away before I do. Hey, guess what? I've had that conversation with both kids. I joked with my daughter that just in case, maybe we should talk about, what do you want at your funeral? It's just truth. It's not a lie. I'm not making up a horror story to scare them. I'm trying to help them. You know what I said to my daughter when she was losing her shit? I said, what's the worst possible thing that could ever happen? She goes, she stops crying. You or mom dying. I was like, well, that's going to happen, period. What are you going to do about it? She didn't grasp it. And I said, look, sweetie, can you do me a favor? At my funeral, when people are walking around sobbing, and you might be sobbing too, that's fine. Don't sit down. Go check on people. Be bigger than the pain. Be tough. I don't know if I can drop the F-bomb here, but no? Okay, not Sarah. I said, be the toughest one in the room. And she got her stuff together and she went upstairs at 1 a.m. and got a good night's sleep and aced the exam. And that's what I really want from them. I want them to know that reality is coming for them, whether they like it or not. And it doesn't help them to avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when people pass away, some of the toughest stuff, and it divides families, that we didn't have the tough conversation. Grandpa's going to die. He owns 5 properties. What's going to happen? Oh, don't talk about it. Shh. Well, then people don't talk to each other for the rest of their lives. So I'm done. Sorry.
Can we talk a little bit about your tools that you use on a daily and weekly basis? And then I'd like to open it up for questions. So
yeah, we're running short on time. I'm sorry I ramble so much. Tell me
you
to
don't
shut
ramble.
up.
So we talked about the unhappiness.xlsx, whatever that ending is. You also have a few other tools that you use as part of your daily and weekly reflection. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, you know, the unhappiness thing, I only do that like once a year. I mean, there was a really tough time where I think I took 4 years off. But every day I wake up, I make my bed, I go in, I start my oatmeal, I turn on music, I start making my list. And the first list is my basic to-do list, things that are possible, right? And I call it this one thing at a time. And it's 23 lines, and there's 3 columns, small columns, and there's an A priority. There it is, A priority, B priority, C priority. I write down the item and I try to time estimate it so that I know what I'm dealing with. And then depending on, is it important, right? Do I really want to do it or feel like it needs to be done? You know, it might get an A or B or C priority. And there are some things that have to get done today. You know, there's a supreme sense of urgency and they might get an A, B, or C, depending. The toughest thing here is estimating the time. So I do this quickly, and then I take this sheet and I put it aside and I pull open my second sheet. And the second sheet is the top 3, which is that landscape view. And the top 3 is just kind of a summary, like what's my overall purpose for the day? What are the main 3 things I really want to get done? What are the 3 things I'm thankful for? Oh, not that one. I'm sorry. There's another one.
I got it.
Top 3. And yeah, that one. Could you blow it up maybe?
Yeah.
And this is my daily checklist. Like, this is just my overall high level summary of what do I want to get done? You know, did I clean the house a little bit? Did I do a little bit of work? What am I thankful for? Did I read my opus, which is the first line? I did this. At least I let it happen, is the header of my opus list of 61 items.
And can you give us just a quick example? Like, you don't have to read your whole opus, but could you just give us an example of 1 or 2 things that's on your opus?
Well, my opus list is broken down into categories. And the first big category is true self. And very, very high on the list of true self is I try not to judge, blame, or assume, period. And so I really try to be mindful of that. Am I judging? Am I blaming? Am I assuming? And I'm always trying to catch myself. Another one might be support my children even when we're at odds, or keep going. I mean, we could flash the screen, or I could put my glasses on, but it's just things that I've figured out that mean something to me. And I read it every single morning, all 61 items. And I pick out one thing that kind of grabs me today. And it says to me that this is a reminder for me. And so my daily to-dos, if I look at my opus is stay put here and now in reality. It's the singular one and only today. Today is a day I will never get back. That's number 1. Line number 20. It's under kids. Help them learn to live their life their way, to travel, explore, practice self-care, practice independence, truth, and embrace their mistakes. And keep going. You know, oh, you got the screen. But just all the things that I figured out that work, but it changes every day. I make some kind of note or modification on that thing every day. And then the last one, the last of the 3 lists for the day is it's today I will do this, and it's a schedule. And so once I figure out what my current commitments are, once I figure out what things off of my to-do list or priorities, I try to put priorities first. I look at my top 3 list. It really doesn't take that long. And I know it's complicated, but this is my schedule. This is my calendar. And I say time frame from 5 a.m. to 6:30. I eat breakfast. I look at my list. I check Messenger. I send an email or 2. And then at 6:30, I start working, and it goes till 8. And one never gets accomplished 100% every time. Something always changes. But the value is that I have a plan, and I put my priorities first. And most of the time, I hit all my priorities for the day. And I don't do everything. Some days I do, but they're usually out of order somehow. So, and then the last one is just a weekly scorecard, real quick. Did I stretch today? Did I hydrate? Did I drink at least 2 liters of water today? Did I identify my top 3? Did I exercise today? You have that list too, but Those are my lists. That's what I do every day. And then I'm off and running. And I might glance at my values, which is, stuck right in front of my opus. And that's my daily, it's a weekly checklist. Did I exercise? Did I read or write? Did I clean the house? Did I execute my top 3? Did I put forth my best effort? That's a 1 to 10 scale. Did I stretch? And then what time did I go to bed? I'm famous for only sleeping 5 hours still. And I try not to, but it happens. But it doesn't happen on accident. I'm aware of it. And I think for all these things, I try to live on purpose, with purpose, and not to let my life and my day control me. And when things get out of whack, I can adjust. And when things get out of whack, I might not know why, and I might have not seen them coming, but I adjust quickly. I'm like, oh shoot, I can't do that A. That'll be first thing on the list tomorrow. Or, oh shoot, I got to do that. There's not a lot of time. I'll sacrifice all my C's, whatever. So that's my list. Every single day. I mean, not every single day, probably 93% of the time. There's 1 day out of 14. There's 1 day out of 2 weeks that I just don't do it because either I don't want to, or I don't need to, or I'm too busy doing something else.
Fabulous. And I think you mentioned something that I think could be the tagline for all of this, really everything we talked about today, which is whatever you do, it's not happening on accident. Whatever you do, you are doing with intention. So this whole framework that we talked about, your opus is a list of your values and what matters to you. You check in on that each day. Your list of what you might want to do, you're consciously, intentionally making that list. You're looking at your daily list to think about what really matters for today. How do I want to prioritize that? You're looking at your time and thinking about how you want to spend it. And if you are unhappy or something's bugging you, I just actually tried that template out last night for something that was feeling a little off for me, and went through that exercise of, okay, what feels off? The unhappiness, XLS, what's the solution, barrier, etc. So again, you're looking at it with intention, such that your life is not happening to you. You are in the driver's seat for your life. And that doesn't mean that things don't happen or that unexpected things don't come up, but you are consciously engaging with your life, and you're making conscious choices about how you act and how you spend your time.
Exactly. I think it's more live your life on purpose, with purpose. Intention is funny, like not not in reference to intention, but on Monday, something popped up for me and it took me 3 hours and it derailed my whole day. But I was able to adjust because I had inventory of what was going on. Intention, really quick. My son's taking philosophy in college, and one of the exercises was, what's important, intention or result? And I'm like, intention all day long. And he goes, no. And, we got into a discussion and I won.
Not that you were keeping track and not that you're competitive, right?
Well, and I'll lose all day long because I don't know shit about a lot of stuff, granted, right? I figured it out my own way and it might work for me and nobody else. But intention, I explained it to him, and I think I got this from some weird Eastern thing. And it basically is intention, okay? A man dies. The person who cut that man and that man died, should he be put in jail for murder? And my son's like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, intention, turn it around. You say result is what matters. The man's dead. You can't change that. But where did it come from? Another man cut him with a knife and he died. What was the intention? He might have been at an ATM and somebody came up and stabbed him in the kidney for all his cash. Yeah, put the guy on trial. But the man died and another man cut him with a knife, and the man who cut him with a knife was a doctor trying to save his life. Intention. So let's live with intention, with purpose, on purpose. I don't know if we have time for questions, do we?
Well, I think that's a beautiful statement to officially end with. So we'll go ahead and conclude officially, and then I'll leave the Zoom open so that we can stay on for questions and conversations for anyone who's interested in that. So for anyone who needs to jump off, thank you so much for being here. And Roger, thank you for the awesome conversation and sharing your tools and a glimpse of your daily and weekly practices with us. It's been awesome to talk through all of this with you. And again, after we conclude, we'll leave a little space for anyone who can stay afterwards.
Great. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, for those of you who have to jump off, thank you again for being here and thanks for coming. And for anyone who'd like to stay, we'll stay on the line and open it up for questions or thoughts or conversation. And feel free to submit your questions either by coming off of mute or in the chat. And Roger,
I'll just say,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, there you go.
I think a couple people are interested in using the tools. Is there a way in which we could share a bit more about those afterwards for anyone who's interested?
Of course, we can,
okay.
I'll get them to you and you can distribute them or put them on your website at Zing Collaborative.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say real quick, I'm sorry for straying a little bit there, but that's the first time I talked about a lot of that stuff. And there's a lot more. There's some really ugly, dark stuff, but we just don't have time for everything. But so thanks for putting up with me.
Hey, Roger, Dave
Yes,
Tambo here.
Sure. Hi, Dave.
Hey, this was great. And it was interesting because I was listening to what you said and your comment just now that there's so much there. I read a psychiatrist named Gordon Livingston. He has some interesting books. They're not really self-help, is more introspection, short essays.
Yeah.
But one of them that made me think what you just said was, he has a whole essay that says, you've never suffered enough. There's no finite amount that, okay, you've gone through it all. And the first line is about, after a catastrophic loss like the death of a child or a spouse, people think you've suffered enough, but that's why having the toolkit or a mechanism or a framework for dealing with difficult situations, what are you going to do about it? But it amazed me when I saw that the first time, and then I saw it in real life at a organization we're involved with, where I said, wow, we don't really have it that bad. Somebody's really got stuff and they're still going. They're still pushing forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. The reality is there's always going to be something else, just like you said. And we carry our own pain. Our our window getting broken, our stained glass window getting broken might be the worst thing that ever happens in our life. Or our wife just passes away with our kids wondering what happened. And it's all relative. But yeah, it will keep coming. And the thing is to try to face it so that you can bounce back as best as possible, as soon as possible. So thank you, sir. Good.
One last thing to say,
Yeah.
and I think I heard it in all the stuff you were saying, but I've heard this adage that whatever you're looking for, the truth is found inside you.
It is. There's nowhere else to look. And that's where I had to dig. And even when my life was seemingly perfect, it wasn't. And only I had that answer or the key. So good to see you.
Thanks for sharing. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. What other questions are in the space, or comments or thoughts?
Roger, I'm curious. Your sisters lived through the same upbringing. How have they fared? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Laird. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm taking a second.
Sure.
One of my sisters, I wouldn't wish her life on anybody. You manage, you manage. We all have our own reality and we just do our best. I don't really talk to two of my sisters. I talk to one of them. We're very close. And I wouldn't want her life. I try to support her. I don't know how to answer that question, Laird. I love you, dude, but I can't figure that one out. You want to try again?
It's okay. It was a bit of a loaded question, but I'm just curious. I guess what I'm really going after is if they, to the extent that they didn't find the wisdom that you had, then let me put it this way. What do you think was different for you that allowed you to find your path in a way that is gratifying and satisfying in your life?
I think to some degree, I don't know, right? We could ask them, but I think to some degree, none of them had a drug addiction career like I did. Thank goodness. Not everybody finished school. And nobody had a professional athletic career where the supreme structure was paramount.
Mm-hmm.
All three of my sisters are tough as nails, man. I can't hold a candle to them on a lot of stuff. But that's the only thing I can point to that is a major differentiator. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Laird. What other questions are here, or comments or thoughts?
Come on, we have to have at least 3.
Look at you coming back to that structure, that tidy top 3.
I guess I have a question. What are you most looking forward to? So there's, out of all of the dirt, something is going to bloom. So what is something that you're looking forward to in the next couple of months or even couple of years because of the tough stuff you've went through?
Well, my life's been blooming the whole time, Abby. I have, I have kids and a career, and it just blooms all day long. I think that to answer your question though, and thank you, the thing I look forward to the most is helping my kids, supporting my kids with whatever they choose to do this summer. And we haven't really figured that out. And then I have about 5 or 6 people that I mentor mostly young people with substance abuse problems or pasts. And watching those people like get their stuff together, oh my gosh, it's so satisfying. And just to help and support and to watch my kids struggle and learn and then make good decisions, make bad decisions, and figure it out on their own. There's nothing more thrilling than that to me.
I appreciate that response, because without your story, you wouldn't be able to help people in the exact same way. Like, I wouldn't be able to mentor those people the way you could, because I have no experience with it. So it's amazing that you're able to use those experiences to do so much good in the world.
Thank you, Abby.
Beautiful.
Roger, it's Dave again. Do you think
Again? Does he
yeah,
get to go
I
twice?
want to throw something out there. Do you think that your athletic and your competitiveness is beneficial in following along with what you're doing, your plan, your system?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's a lot of it. It's discipline. And it's funny, I lost my train of thought earlier when Sarah had asked me a question, but she had said something like, what's your suggestion to people that could get started? And thank goodness, thank you for saying that, because now I get to come around to a critical thing, probably more critical than anything, is I wanted to stop doing drugs, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't get started, right? By the time I decided to stop doing drugs, it took me 5 years to actually do it. And so when I was training, I had this brutal cycling coach, Coach Troy, and Troy had me on this crazy schedule, and I had to train like 50 days in a row, and I had 1 day off. Well, in Baltimore, in the middle of winter, it might be 30 degrees and raining, and I had to do 3 hours today. And I didn't want to do 3 hours today. I wanted to stay in bed. But I never stayed in bed. I got up and I trained. How was I motivated to do that? Right? What was the motivation that got me up and got me going? And Sarah, this is a big point. This might be the biggest point of the whole thing, that how do you get started? And so for me, when I stopped doing drugs, I figured out that my mindset was going to be more than I wanted to do drugs, because I did. I wanted to not do drugs. So I wanted to not do drugs in front of everything else. But then, as Dave Tiambeau just says, what did you learn from your athletics? And it was this, that when it was 36 degrees and raining, or 30 degrees and raining, and I had 3 hours to do, I didn't want to get up, because I was thinking of the immediate desire of staying in bed and not getting wet. And so what I did is I skipped to the other end of it, and I said, well, more than I want to stay in bed, I want to be competitive, and I want to match the expectations of my sponsors. So instead of thinking about staying in bed, I thought about how much stronger I'll be after today's training ride. And my friend David Duvall said famously, I've never had a bad ride once I got out there. And so I call it getting to the curb. The 3 hours is no problem. The rain is no problem. The 30 degrees is no problem. The effort and 2 hours of hill repeat, no problem. The hardest part was getting to the curb, getting out the door, and getting started. And so what I did is I tried to think about, if I can just get started, if I can just make it to the curb, I'm fine. And I raced for 17 years. You know, I trained 600 to 900 hours a year. That's 2 to 3 hours a day for 17 years. And my thing was, get to the curb, get to the curb. And as soon as I get to the curb and I take that first pedal stroke, and even though it's cold and raining, I'm fine. I'm happy. I never had a bad ride in my life, even when I got hurt. It's get to the curb.
Yeah, I found the same thing as getting started in the accountability level. And it's never as bad as you think it's going to be to get out there, but get out there.
It's good once you get out there.
Yeah.
It's just hard getting up.
Overcoming inertia.
Yeah.
That's so good. I know the habit research supports that too, where, if you want to build a new habit, we tend to start with these really big things like we want to run a 5K or a marathon or whatever. But what the habit research says is exactly aligned with what both of you are saying. The first goal should be put on your running shoes and go outside for 1 minute, or even just go to the gym, physically go to the gym when we can go to gyms again, and show up there. Don't even say you're going to do anything or lift a weight or go on a treadmill or anything. The first step is going to the gym. And then, like both of you are saying, then from there you can build the habits, but only after that first step, which, as both of you are saying, is often the hardest.
I was dealing with this just last week with my son, and we were talking about, now that his sophomore college year is over, what were the hits and misses? And one of them was procrastination. And so we talked about discipline, and we talked about motivation, and we talked about exactly what you're talking about, taking the first step. With him and with me, if I wanted to run a marathon, that putting my shoes on and going outside was not the first step. The first step to me was figure out where the running shoe store is.
Yeah, totally.
Or buying running shoes and
Yep.
have them sit on my bed for a year before I actually put them on. Funny story, I have two things that I hardly ever do that I try to do every day still. One of them is stretch, which I used to be fanatical about, but I haven't got my momentum back yet. And the next one is floss my teeth. So what I do is I have this stretching rope that I use for my hamstrings. And every morning after I make my bed, I take my stretching rope off the door knob of my bedroom and I lay it on my bed. Because at night, when I have to pull my covers back, first I have to pick up my stretching rope. Well, half of the time when I pick up the stretching rope, I'm like, I might as well do it. It's already in my hand. So I lay down and I do it. Well, flossing was the same way. I had these little preformed little things with tight string on it, and they were sitting in my medicine cabinet, and I never touched them. And then I took them out and I opened the bag and I poured them in a little dish, and I have a little dish on my counter, and I've refilled it like 10 times in the last year. It's bad hygiene, I'm sorry, but it's you got to put stuff right in front of you. You got to break it down. It's like eat the elephant. How do you do that? One bite at a time.
That's how we tell our sons.
It's the smallest little thing, right? It's the smallest little thing. Figure out where the running shoe store is. Tear out a page of the magazine that has a pair of shoes on it that you like.
Mm-hmm.
Basic, lowest common denominator. But yeah, I don't read your research, Sarah, but I'm glad it aligns. So
I think that's great. Those are awesome examples too. And, thinking about daily to-do lists, it's the same thing. Like, do the project or finish the thing is usually like 20 steps later. So I love what you're saying about what's the first absolute smallest thing, which really might be ripping the page out of the magazine, or opening the bag of the flossing things. I think those are great examples.
Well, it's funny, and keep going, right? Because for a while there, I just had all my sheets floating around and I'd lose track of them. And now they're in a binder. I have a nice binder and it's all organized, of course. But one thing I do with my lists is, so in case they get pulled out of the binder, they're green so that I can see them, and it's silly little things like that you just want to help yourself, or at least keep yourself from doing something stupid.
Mm-hmm. I think
like
that's
losing your list. That would be
totally.
stupid.
And I feel like that's another really cool theme that you've highlighted today, Roger, is how to use very tactical, tangible, concrete structures to help ourselves with big, squishy, hard, ambiguous things. So I think, those are awesome tips for big and small things that we're trying to do in our lives.
The problem is, I put that to-do list together with the ABC priority. There's 23 lines. I have 2 or 3 backup pages at all times. I have at least 40 or 50 things on my list, but I keep transferring them and cleaning them up. And there's times I might only do 10 things or 5 things in a day, not 40. And the mistake that I was making at the beginning is I had a list of 40 and 20 of them were A priorities. I never, never, ever, ever, ever give more than 3 things an A priority.
Yeah.
And the only time another thing gets an A priority is when one just got scratched off, because
Right.
I can't focus on more than 3 at once. If I say I want to do 10 things today, I might not get any of them done. But if I say I got 3 things I want to do, almost all the time I get at least 2 done. That's better math. That's better math to me. You know?
Can I ask a question? Is it beneficial?
You again?
Yeah, this is
No.
interesting stuff to me. Is it beneficial if you write it down so that then you're not constantly working on it, except when you are consciously working on it? Do you know what I'm saying? To get to, so you control what's in your head.
Yeah. So great question. I started writing stuff down like that, to-dos, in 1997 when I first got the job with Trek Bicycles. I was a sales rep. I was managing a big, complicated business, a lot of different accounts. I was on the move, road rep all the time. And every single day for almost the first year, I would forget something. And I had lists, but they were all over the place. And so now I spend on average an hour and 15 minutes every single day organizing my stuff. I never forget anything. I don't leave the house doing an errand and forget the other thing that I was supposed to take with me, because it's written down. And it's the ease and the calm that I feel when I'd walk out the door knowing that I didn't forget anything. I know I got it covered because I got a list of 50 things I just cleaned up into 10. But it's the confidence, Dave. It's the confidence in knowing that you got your bases covered.
But my question centered more on that if you have too many things that you're just working on in your head, you don't have them on paper, does it help to keep your head clear just to get through the regular part of the day? And then when you're working on that particular issue, negative aspect, you're only working on it then. So you're not overwhelmed with everything.
Exactly. So back up maybe 20 years, the cool thing was to be a good multitasker. Now it's a dirty word in business. So that's why my to-do list is called this one thing at a time. And I had to force myself. I called it that because I wanted to focus on only that one thing. And you're exactly right. You know, when I go gardening today and plant all my vegetables, and I have 14 other things that could be on my mind, I don't worry about it. I wear headphones and I focus on my breathing and my planting, because I know that when I do walk inside, my list is there and I'll get right back on it.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Very cool.
Yeah.
It's an awesome question, Dave. And I love what you're saying.
Get him off.
Yeah. And, you know, I call it clearing, which is exactly what you're both talking about. And when I teach about leadership, it's one of the most foundational things we do, which is how can we get the stuff that's swirling around in our head, which always is a lot, get it out of our head and put it down on a sheet of paper. Because especially in our current world, we always have so many things on our mind, and it's really hard to be present, not only with your tasks, but with each other. It's really hard to be present with each other when we're constantly distracted by all the other things swirling around. So, you know, Roger, that's an awesome gift that you give to yourself when you go do your errands. And it's an amazing gift that we can give to other people by just allowing ourselves to be present and be in the moment, because we've taken the stuff out of our head and put it somewhere else, you know, to address, like you're saying, Dave, when we decide to address it.
Yeah, you know, you make a good point. And so if I'm running around somewhere and I bump into somebody and I might have a bunch of things on my list, I can take the time and I can focus on them and I can look them in the eye. And like my friend Dave Mitchell says, you know, you're listening actively, you're agreeing, you're tuning in to what they're saying, you're feeding it back, and you don't miss anything. Instead of, you don't even hear what they say if you're thinking of your list. So I want to hear from Lisa Joquim. Is she still on there? Yeah. Lisa, let's hear a question.
I'm on here. I'm just listening to all of the beautiful things that everybody is saying and asking, and it's so nice to see you and hear you talking, because I have more of a comment. I worked for Roger
Oh, come on.
many years, and he is like, here we are, I mean, I don't even know how many, 15, 20 years later, and Roger is still, I still regard him as my favorite boss and my greatest mentor in my life. And I really, really appreciated everything that you have, like all the gifts that you've given over the years to me. And I really appreciate you, Roger. And I don't know if you realize how much you've been a great mentor to so many people, especially me.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And I think I made this point earlier that this isn't about me, it's about us. Because anything I got, I give away. And anything that I can do to help other people, I'm going to do it. You know, it's funny, when I was really, really bad drug addict, my wish was that my dad had a really cool friend who could talk sense into me, and he didn't. And somebody's got their microphone on. And I missed that opportunity. And so that's part of the role I'm trying to fill now, is especially the young people who want to be able to talk to somebody who gets it. And besides helping my kids, there's nothing more important in my life than I do accept that. So thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, like that you're trying to find that, like, how do you find that role again, or how do you like manifest that into something today? And what's interesting that you say that, because I always think that about you relative to who I work for now, is that I kind of crave that leadership where somebody is very empathetic and very understanding and motivates you to being your best self and using the gifts that you have. And I think that you have an incredible opportunity to teach other people how to lead with that empathy. How do you bring out the greatest strengths? Because I can tell you, there is nobody like you, Roger, and you have a massive gift for the people that you lead. And I think that being able to teach others how to lead with empathy and compassion and helping to bring out the best in their employees and their team, I think that's a major strength that you have.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You're too kind. I've had a couple people tell me that I'm too open and too honest. And I make a lot of guys nervous because I tell them I love them. And I think that's just a reflection of my dad. But life's too short. It really is.
Roger, I think that's a great point you just made about being honest. I think it allows you not to have those things just bottled up. I think that when you do that, I think it makes people uncomfortable because everybody's kind of feels that being vulnerable, showing that vulnerability is weakness, but I think it's actually strength. It allows you to be stronger, I think.
That's such a good point. And I think that that's what separates you, Roger, is that you are honest and you're relatable. Like, it doesn't make people feel like there's a big barrier or a big difference. It's that you're able to bring people in and say, hey, I get you. Like, I'm going through stuff too. And because even in your hardest time, I was working for you in 2005. And even during your hardest time, you still had the ability to lead a big team for complicated projects, and you were able to bring out the best in all of us. And it's kind of like what you were saying about how you told you like to tell your daughter, hey, if I die, don't sit down, go check on other people. And I think that that's a reflection of who you are, is that as an employee during your hardest time, you were still standing up and going around and checking on everybody else.
Thank you, Lisa and Dave. It comes at a price, though. I lost 2 friends in the last year, just because I was honest. And I tried to, I tried to be super appropriate, but the truth is the truth. And I gambled. And, you know, I lost him as a friend, but I stayed true to my values. And that's what's important to me. I have 8 documented, meticulously prepared values. And number one is that I try to practice truth, honesty, and trust in everything I do. And if I wouldn't have written that down, I wouldn't be able to face it and use it to help guide me. So, thank you. What else? Come on.
I'm going to say
Roger.
thanks and
Not
sign
Dave
off.
Tambo.
I'm going to sign off.
All right, buddy.
Dave.
Love you, guy.
Yeah,
Love you too, Raj.
All right. Bye.
Roger, but everything that you're talking about, I think, has so much application for so many people because it goes to, you know, regardless of your avocation, what we bring as individual humans has, you know, is what matters. So my question, you know, all this begs, because I get it, you know, this is valuable stuff. You need to get it out there. This is a great venue. It's worked, I think, for all these who have attended. But in a larger, more consumable way, is there an app? Is there a book? Is there
Killing me.
Were you a plant laird?
Yeah, where's the book?
Are you the Sarah? Are you the one that's pushing for the book? Is that right?
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, actually. But the reality is I did 2 podcasts last week, and on one of them, I snuck out that I'm writing a memoir to my children, my whole life story with all my tools and all my lessons. And this is a precursor to what Sarah was pushing for. And maybe that thing gets edited down and put into consumable form. We'll see. I don't know. But in the meantime, Sarah and I are going to try to figure out if this was valuable in any way to anybody. What do we do with it? And we'll see. You know, a friend of mine is just Hollywood level video producer guy. I think his wife's on right now. And there's options, dude, but I don't know. But I don't care about anything right now except finishing the memoir to my children by Christmas, wrapped under the tree. There's only gonna be 3 copies, professionally printed and bound, wrapped up, and that's it. 2 for each of them, 1 for me. 88,000 words into my first attempt at a gross piece before I start editing it down. So we'll see. We'll see. But if nothing else, yeah, dude, I agree. But it's not the story that drives it to me. It's the people's willingness to use it. And it's funny because this didn't come up. A lot of stuff didn't come up. It's funny because half of my story was never even told today. And that's fine. I don't care. But what I learned, besides truth, because that's the most important thing for me, pain, right? Endurance, courage, grit. What's the key to that? We haven't discussed it. We didn't even say the word yet.
Well, I think this.
I'll say real quick. Let me finish the thought. Dave Tambo brought it up. Like, what did you learn from bike racing? Well, that's what I learned: grit, courage, how to hang in there, and it's willingness. It's willingness. When I was doing bike races and they were 3 hours long, and I was wearing my heart rate monitor, but I didn't want to see it, so I turned off the beepy alarms and turned it upside down, and I reviewed it afterwards. You get to anaerobic threshold aerobically and your body starts to cramp up. And I would do a 3-hour race and my average heart rate for the whole event would be my anaerobic threshold. So I'm working really hard, suffering. And the thing I learned was how I could do that. I was willing. I was willing to suffer. It's not about my ability to suffer, right? It's my willingness. My second wife, my ex-wife, she wasn't an athlete until we got together. Now she's an athlete. She's a world-class ultramarathon runner, Leadville, Wasatch, Vermont. And you show up, and those big events, those big hard events, it's not even half physical strength. It's mental. And if you're not willing to run for 42 hours and it's rainy and you're hungry and there's blisters on your feet, but you're going to get to that finish line, they'll have to carry you. It's willingness. And you have to be able to identify it, name it, place it in your sights, and suck it up. And I was willing to suffer and pay the price and get broken and whatever else it took to do my best and live up to my responsibility of racing. But willingness, okay, Sarah, that's interesting, right? Are you willing to do the hard work? Are you willing to sit down and maybe spend 4 or 5 hours on your unhappiness.xlsx spreadsheet to figure it out? Are you willing? That's your first step. That's put your shoes on, right? You have to be willing. You got to face it.
Well, I think that's why the story ties into so there's the story and then there's the tools. But the story informs the person and establishes some commonality. The humanity of your story establishes commonality with other people's experiences, whether theirs is emotional trauma or physical trauma. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, we all know the human experience. Yours is, sort of helps showcase what commitment, willingness, grit you've brought, and that's inspiring. So that ties in with the tools.
Yeah, I see it. And that helps me, because to a large degree, I kind of poo-poo the story. But with that, I get it. I get it. Thank you.
I mean, anybody could send me those 3 spreadsheets and I'd go, yeah, right. But to know how effectively they've operated in your life when you've applied them, that's inspiring to me.
Yeah.